The Coast Guard found Captain Marcus Sterling floating face down in his life jacket 43 miles southeast of Bermuda, clutching a waterproof bag that contained the most disturbing final message in maritime history. Inside that bag were 17 pages of handwritten notes, increasingly erratic as they progressed, describing something so impossible that investigators initially dismissed them as the ravings of a man driven insane by isolation. But when they matched Sterling's account against the debris field, the forensic evidence, and the emergency radio transmissions recorded by 3 different stations, they realized they were looking at a disaster unlike anything in their files. What killed Marcus Sterling and his crew of 2 wasn't a storm, wasn't human error, and wasn't mechanical failure. It was something that had been living inside his 47-foot ketch for over 6 years, growing stronger and more intelligent with each passing month, hidden in the one place that no surveyor, no inspector, and no boat owner ever thinks to examine. By the time you finish reading this story, you'll understand why that oversight has turned dozens of recreational sailboats into floating death traps, and why your own boat might already be harboring the same silent killer that destroyed the Windward Dream and everyone aboard her. The irony cuts deep when you understand who Marcus Sterling was. This wasn't some inexperienced weekend sailor who got caught in conditions beyond his skill level. Sterling was a former Navy submarine commander with 22 years of underwater warfare experience. He'd navigated the Arctic ice pack, commanded vessels in 3 different conflicts, and earned decorations for seamanship that most sailors never even dream of achieving. His crew weren't novices either. Janet Morrison was a marine engineer with 15 years in commercial shipping, and David Chen held a master's license and had been delivering boats professionally for over a decade. These were people who understood the ocean, respected its power, and knew how to handle emergencies at sea. Sterling first saw the Windward Dream in 2017 at a boat show in Newport, Rhode Island. She was a Swan 47, one of the most respected blue water cruising boats ever built, with a reputation for strength, seaworthiness, and attention to detail that bordered on obsessive. Her previous owner had maintained her meticulously, and the survey report read like a love letter to proper boat care. Hull integrity was perfect, rigging was recently replaced, engine had been completely rebuilt, and every system from navigation to safety equipment exceeded Coast Guard requirements. The surveyor's final comment was prophetic in its confidence. "This vessel represents the gold standard of offshore cruising boats. I would trust her in any conditions, anywhere in the world." For Sterling, the Windward Dream represented the fulfillment of a promise he'd made to himself during his darkest moments in military service. Sitting in the cramped confines of a nuclear submarine, breathing recycled air, and watching sonar screens for months at a time, he dreamed of sailing his own boat across open oceans, under clean wind and endless sky. The dream had sustained him through 3 deployments, 2 divorces, and the slow realization that 22 years of military life had left him with more scars than medals. His retirement plan was elegant in its simplicity. Buy the perfect boat, spend 2 years preparing her for blue water sailing, then embark on a circumnavigation that would take him to every remote anchorage and pristine island that his submarine duty had forced him to see only as coordinates on a chart. It wasn't just about sailing. It was about reclaiming a relationship with the ocean that had been poisoned by years of viewing it as a battlefield. Sterling spent 18 months and nearly $200,000 transforming the already excellent Windward Dream into his vision of the perfect cruising boat. He replaced every piece of running rigging with the best materials available. The electrical system was completely rewired with redundant circuits and marine-grade components. New sails were commissioned from a premier loft cut specifically for the boat's rig and his planned sailing routes. The interior was redesigned to maximize storage and improve weight distribution for long ocean passages. The safety equipment installation was where Sterling's military background really showed. He installed 2 separate life raft systems, a primary 12-person model and a backup 6-person unit. Emergency beacons included both satellite and VHF models with global coverage. The medical kit was comprehensive enough to handle trauma surgery, water makers, emergency food supplies, survival suits, fire suppression systems. Every conceivable emergency scenario had been analyzed and prepared for with military precision. But Sterling wasn't just preparing equipment, he was building a crew. Janet Morrison had approached him at a boat show, intrigued by his reputation and his serious approach to ocean sailing. Her background in marine engineering made her invaluable for maintaining complex systems during long passages, and her calm personality balanced Sterling's sometimes intense military bearing. David Chen joined the team 6 months later, recruited through sailing networks that recognized his skill and professionalism. Together, they formed what Sterling called his dream team, experienced professionals who shared his vision of responsible, well-prepared ocean sailing. Their shakedown cruise was a month-long passage from Newport to the Caribbean, with stops in Chesapeake Bay, the Outer Banks, and the Bahamas. It was designed to test every system, refine procedures, and give the crew time to develop the communication patterns and trust that would be essential during longer passages. The trip exceeded every expectation. The Windward Dream proved to be everything her reputation promised: fast, comfortable, and reassuringly predictable in all conditions. The only minor issue during the entire shakedown was a subtle but persistent odor that occasionally emerged from the forward sections of the boat. It wasn't strong, barely noticeable unless you were specifically looking for it, and it seemed to come and go without any apparent pattern. Janet spent hours trying to track down the source, checking every storage locker, inspecting all plumbing connections, even crawling into the chain locker with a flashlight to examine the anchor road and surrounding fiberglass. Sterling logged the odor in the boat's maintenance records, but classified it as minor and non-critical. The smell wasn't dangerous. There were no signs of fuel leaks, electrical problems, or structural issues. It was organic and slightly sweet, like something natural that had gotten damp and was slowly decomposing. In an older boat, such smells were common and usually harmless. The Windward Dream was nearly 15 years old, and despite her excellent condition, it wouldn't be surprising if she had developed a few harmless quirks. Their departure from the Caribbean was scheduled for March 2023. Perfect timing to reach the Panama Canal during favorable weather and arrive in the South Pacific as the cyclone season ended. The send-off party in Barbados was everything Sterling had envisioned. Dozens of fellow sailors, local officials, and even representatives from yacht clubs back home who had followed their preparations with interest. The Windward Dream looked magnificent under the Caribbean sun, her fresh bottom paint gleaming and her new sails perfectly set for the trade wind sailing that lay ahead. The first leg of their circumnavigation was a relatively straightforward passage to Panama. 1,200 miles of trade wind, sailing across some of the most beautiful waters in the world. The Windward Dream settled into her rhythm immediately, logging consistent daily runs of 180 to 200 nautical miles under favorable conditions. Sterling's military precision showed in the watch schedules, navigation procedures, and daily maintenance routines that kept the boat operating at peak efficiency. Janet's daily engineering reports during this period paint a picture of a boat performing exactly as designed. Day 7, all systems nominal. Engine running smoothly, charging systems operating perfectly, fresh water production exceeding consumption. Hull speed calculations confirm we're getting maximum performance from the sail plan. Minor odor in forward section persists, but shows no signs of intensification. But the odor was intensifying, though so gradually that none of them noticed the change. What had been barely detectable during their shakedown cruise was now strong enough to be noticeable whenever they spent extended time in the forward cabin or chain locker area. David attributed it to the tropical climate, reasoning that higher temperatures and humidity might be causing some stored organic material to decompose more actively. Their arrival in Panama was met with the usual bureaucratic delays and infrastructure challenges that define transiting the canal. The Windward Dream was scheduled for passage, but mechanical problems with one of the locks created a backlog that stretched their stay to nearly 2 weeks. Sterling used the delay productively, having the boat hauled for bottom cleaning and a thorough inspection of all through-hull fittings and underwater hardware. It was during this haul-out that they discovered the first real sign that something was wrong. The bottom paint showed unusual patterns of discoloration and bubbling around the keel root area, the place where the keel joins the hull. The local yard manager, Carlos, had seen similar damage before and attributed it to osmotic blistering, a common problem in fiberglass boats exposed to warm water for extended periods. Normal, he assured Sterling in heavily accented English. The fiberglass absorbs water and sometimes chemicals react with the resin. Not dangerous for structure, but can cause smell like you describe. Sterling wasn't entirely convinced. His submarine training had taught him to be suspicious of any unexplained changes in a vessel's condition, and the pattern of paint damage seemed too localized and too regular to be simple osmotic blistering. But Carlos was the expert, and his yard had been servicing cruising boats for 25 years. More importantly, they had a schedule to maintain. The Canal Authority had confirmed their transit date, and the weather window for crossing the Pacific was optimal. The canal passage itself was flawless. Sterling's military background served them well during the complex procedures required to transit the locks, and the Windward Dream performed beautifully throughout the 10-hour process. By evening, they were anchored in the Pacific Ocean, officially beginning the next phase of their circumnavigation with the vast expanse of the world's largest ocean stretching endlessly ahead of them. Their first Pacific passage was to the Galapagos Islands, 800 miles of sailing across the equator into waters that Sterling had dreamed of visiting since his submarine days. The trade winds were perfect, steady at 15 to 20 knots from the northeast, and the Windward Dream was in her element. Day after day, she logged impressive distances while providing a stable, comfortable platform for her crew. It was during this passage that Janet first noticed the odor was no longer intermittent. What had been an occasional annoyance was now a constant presence in the forward sections of the boat. More concerning, it seemed to be affecting stored materials in that area. Several items that had been stowed in forward lockers showed signs of accelerated deterioration. Metal objects developing corrosion, fabrics becoming discolored, and even some plastic items showing signs of chemical degradation. David's investigation revealed the extent of the problem. It's not just an odor anymore, he reported to Sterling during their evening briefing. Something is creating a seriously corrosive environment in the forward sections. I found stainless steel fittings that are showing rust, aluminum components with white powder corrosion, and even some of the fiberglass seems to be softening in certain areas. Sterling's military training kicked in. This wasn't a minor maintenance issue anymore. It was a potential threat to the structural integrity of their boat. He ordered a complete investigation, with all 3 crew members spending the next day methodically examining every accessible space in the forward section of the boat. What they found was disturbing, but not immediately dangerous. The corrosion was real and accelerating, but it was localized to a relatively small area around the keel attachment zone. The most puzzling discovery was a series of small holes in the fiberglass liner that surrounded the keel attachment points. The holes were perfectly round, about the diameter of a pencil, and they seemed to have been created from the inside out. David's engineering background helped him understand the implications. These holes weren't drilled, he told Sterling. They look like something dissolved or ate through the fiberglass from behind, but that would mean there's some kind of void or space behind the liner that we can't access. Sterling consulted the boat's construction drawings, which showed the keel attachment area as completely solid, lead ballast, encapsulated in fiberglass, with no internal voids or spaces. But the evidence of their own eyes contradicted the plans. Something was happening behind that liner, something that was producing corrosive conditions and somehow creating access holes to the boat's living spaces. Their arrival in the Galapagos was delayed by unfavorable winds, giving them additional time to investigate the growing problem. Janet used her engineering background to research similar issues in other boats, while David attempted to trace the source of the corrosion using chemical test strips and pH measurements. Sterling maintained detailed logs of their observations, his military training demanding precise documentation of any abnormal conditions. What Janet found in her research was deeply unsettling. There were scattered reports from other sailors who had experienced similar problems. Mysterious odors, unexplained corrosion, and structural deterioration centered around keel attachment areas. Most disturbing were accounts from boats that had experienced sudden catastrophic keel failures after months or years of gradually worsening symptoms. In every case, investigations had been inconclusive, with surveyors and naval architects unable to explain how apparently sound keel attachments could fail so completely. David's chemical analysis provided more concrete but equally alarming data. The air in the forward sections of the boat was measurably acidic, with pH levels that explained the accelerated corrosion they were observing. More concerning, the acid levels were increasing daily, suggesting that whatever was producing these conditions was becoming more active or more numerous. Stirling faced a decision that would define the remainder of their voyage. They could abort their circumnavigation and head for major boatyard facilities in California or Australia for extensive investigation and repairs. Or they could continue to French Polynesia, where excellent marine services were available, and hope that the problem stabilized or could be managed for the additional 3,000 miles of sailing required to reach Tahiti. The crew meeting that night was one of the most serious conversations any of them had ever had. Janet argued for continuing. The boat is sailing perfectly. Whatever's happening, it's been developing slowly and shows no signs of sudden acceleration. We're only 2 weeks from Tahiti, and the facilities there are world-class. David was less certain. The rate of change has been increasing. Every day we wait could be making the problem worse. Stirling made the decision based on his assessment of risk versus reward, colored by his understanding that this might be their only chance to complete the circumnavigation they'd planned so carefully. "We continue to Tahiti," he announced, "but we implement full emergency protocols. Life rafts prepared for immediate deployment, emergency beacons tested daily, and continuous radio contact with maritime authorities." But Stirling had underestimated how rapidly the situation was deteriorating. Over the next 48 hours, as they sailed away from the Galapagos toward French Polynesia, the changes in their boat accelerated exponentially. The odor became strong enough to make sleeping in the forward cabin impossible. The mysterious holes in the fiberglass liner multiplied and enlarged. Most alarmingly, they began hearing sounds from within the keel structure itself, subtle but unmistakable sounds of movement, as if something was alive in the supposedly solid ballast. Janet was the first to voice what they were all thinking. "There's something living in our keel," she said, during their morning briefing on their third day out from the Galapagos. "I know how insane that sounds, but it's the only explanation that fits all the evidence. Something organic is in there. It's been growing and reproducing, and it's producing acidic waste products that are eating away at our boat from the inside." Stirling's military background had taught him to consider even unlikely possibilities when conventional explanations failed. The evidence was undeniable. Something was alive inside their keel structure, something that had been there long enough to establish itself and begin reproducing. But what could survive in the sealed, oxygen-limited environment inside an encapsulated keel? And how could it have gotten there in the first place? David provided part of the answer when he researched the boat's history more thoroughly than they had done before purchasing her. The Windward Dream's previous owner had been Dr. Richard Hawthorne, a marine biologist who had used the boat extensively for research in the Caribbean and Pacific. Dr. Hawthorne's published papers dealt with extremophile organisms, creatures that could survive in hostile environments like deep ocean thermal vents, underground caves, and other places where normal life couldn't exist. More disturbing was Dr. Hawthorne's unpublished research, which David found through academic networks and personal contacts. Hawthorne had been investigating organisms that could survive in sealed environments by creating their own micro-ecosystems, producing their own food through chemosynthesis, and adapting to conditions that would kill most other life forms. His final papers, published just months before his death, hinted at discoveries that could revolutionize understanding of life's ability to adapt to extreme conditions. The pieces of the puzzle were forming a terrifying picture. Dr. Hawthorne had somehow introduced organisms into the Windward Dream's keel structure, either accidentally or as part of his research. These organisms had remained dormant for years after his death, but something about Stirling's preparations or their sailing activities had awakened them. Now they were reproducing, growing, and producing waste products that were literally dissolving their boat from within. Stirling's radio calls to maritime authorities in French Polynesia initially met with skepticism. The duty officer at Tahiti Control found it difficult to believe that a well-maintained boat could be experiencing structural failure from biological causes. "If your keel structure was compromised by living organisms," the officer radioed back, "you would be experiencing immediate stability problems. The fact that you're maintaining normal sailing performance suggests that your situation may not be as critical as you believe." Stirling's response was prophetic. "Control, I understand your skepticism, but I'm telling you that we're dealing with something unprecedented. Our boat is being eaten alive from the inside, and the process is accelerating. We may not have long before it reaches a critical failure point. By their 7th day out from the Galapagos, the Windward Dream was no longer the same boat that had departed the Caribbean with such high hopes. The forward third of the boat was now uninhabitable due to the toxic atmosphere created by whatever was living in the keel structure. The crew had moved all essential equipment aft, and they were essentially sailing a boat that was being consumed by its own internal ecosystem. The sounds from within the keel had evolved from subtle movements to distinct patterns that suggested intelligence and communication. Janet, with her engineering background, had begun recording and analyzing these sounds. What she discovered was terrifying. The sounds showed increasing complexity and organization, as if multiple organisms were coordinating their activities and learning to communicate more effectively. Sterling's military training had prepared him for many types of crisis, but nothing had prepared him for the realization that his boat had become a living organism itself, with intentions and capabilities that he couldn't predict or control. The thing living in their keel wasn't just consuming their boat, it was learning about them, studying their routines, and adapting its behavior based on their responses. On their 9th day out from the Galapagos, the crisis reached its climax. David was conducting routine maintenance in the engine compartment when he noticed that one of the mysterious holes in the fiberglass liner had enlarged significantly overnight. More disturbing, it was no longer just a hole. It was an opening that seemed to be actively maintained, with smooth, finished edges that suggested ongoing modification. As David watched in horrified fascination, something emerged from the opening. It wasn't large, about the size of a pencil, but it moved with obvious intelligence and purpose. The creature was unlike anything in his experience, partially translucent, with internal structures that pulsed rhythmically and appendages that seemed designed for both manipulation and sensing. Most disturbing was its behavior. It didn't flee when it detected David's presence, but instead seemed to study him with what could only be described as scientific curiosity. David's shout brought Sterling and Janet running to see what would become their first direct contact with the organisms that had been sharing their boat for thousands of miles. The creature didn't attempt to hide or escape. Instead, it began what could only be described as communication, producing sounds that matched some of the patterns they had been hearing from within the keel structure while using its appendages to manipulate objects in the engine compartment. Janet's scientific background helped her understand what they were witnessing. "It's trying to communicate with us," she said in amazement and terror. "These things have been listening to us, learning our language patterns, and now they're trying to establish contact." But Sterling's military training focused on a more immediate concern. If it's trying to communicate, that means it has something to tell us. And given what it's been doing to our boat, I don't think we're going to like the message. The creature's communication attempt was brief but unmistakable. Using its appendages to manipulate tools and materials in the engine compartment, it constructed a crude but recognizable representation of their boat. Then, with deliberate precision, it demonstrated the structural failure that was about to occur, showing how the keel attachment points had been weakened and how much additional stress would be required to cause complete separation. Sterling understood immediately. The organisms weren't just consuming their boat randomly. They were engineering a controlled failure that would separate the keel from the hull at a time and place of their choosing. They had been studying the boat's construction, learning its weak points, and preparing for a catastrophic failure that would serve their own purposes while eliminating the crew that had been unknowingly transporting them across the Pacific. The implications were staggering. These organisms didn't just want to escape from their fiberglass prison. They wanted to eliminate the witnesses to their existence and their capabilities. They had learned enough about human behavior to understand that discovery would mean investigation, and investigation would threaten their survival and reproduction. The boat failure would appear accidental, the crew would be presumed dead from drowning, and the organisms would be free to establish themselves in their preferred deep water environment. Sterling immediately ordered emergency procedures implemented. Life rafts were prepared for immediate deployment, emergency beacons were activated, and a detailed Mayday call was transmitted on all emergency frequencies. But even as they prepared to abandon their boat, Sterling realized that escaping the Windward Dream might not guarantee their survival. If the organisms were intelligent enough to plan their boat's destruction, they were probably intelligent enough to ensure that no witnesses survived to report their existence. The attack came at 3:47 a.m. on their 10th day out from the Galapagos. Sterling was on watch when he heard what he later described as the sound of the boat's skeleton breaking. It wasn't a single failure, but a coordinated collapse of multiple structural attachment points that had been systematically weakened over months of biological attack. The Windward Dream didn't just lose her keel, she lost her structural integrity in a way that suggested careful planning and precise execution. Janet and David were below when the failure occurred, and they had less than 2 minutes to gather emergency supplies and reach the cockpit before the boat's motion became too violent for safe movement. Sterling's military training took over as he coordinated their abandonment procedures, but even his extensive preparation couldn't account for the intelligence that was orchestrating their disaster. The life raft deployment went exactly as they had practiced, but the boat's sinking didn't follow any normal pattern. Instead of settling gradually as her internal compartments flooded, the Windward Dream seemed to be actively managing her descent, maintaining just enough buoyancy to allow the organisms in her keel structure to escape while ensuring that she would sink completely in deep water where recovery would be impossible. Sterling's final radio transmission, recorded by 3 different shore stations, captured the full horror of their situation. Mayday, Mayday, this is Windward Dream. We have abandoned ship due to total structural failure. Keel separation appears to have been caused by biological agents that have been living inside the boat structure. These organisms show signs of intelligence and coordinated behavior. They have deliberately destroyed our boat and may be planning to eliminate the crew. Request immediate rescue and scientific investigation of this phenomenon. The rescue came too late for Janet and David. When the Coast Guard helicopter reached their position 18 hours later, they found only Sterling, barely alive in his survival suit, clutching the waterproof bag that contained his detailed account of their ordeal. The life raft was partially deflated, with damage that couldn't be explained by normal marine hazards. Of Janet and David, there was no trace except for pieces of their survival gear floating in the debris field. Sterling's account, initially dismissed as the hallucinations of a traumatized survivor, gained credibility when investigators examined the wreckage of the Windward Dream. The keel separation showed signs of systematic weakening that couldn't be explained by normal structural failure modes. More disturbing were the biological samples recovered from the debris. Organic materials that showed cellular structures unlike anything in known marine biology databases. The investigation into the Windward Dream disaster revealed that Dr. Hawthorne's research had gone far beyond what his published papers suggested. His private notes, discovered in storage after the incident, documented experiments with extremophile organisms that he had collected from deep ocean thermal vents near the Galapagos Islands. His goal had been to understand how life could survive in sealed environments like space stations or underwater habitats, but his research had created something far more dangerous. Dr. Hawthorne's final journal entry, dated just weeks before his death, contained a chilling admission. The organisms have exceeded all projections for adaptability and intelligence. They have learned to manipulate their environment, to communicate with each other, and to plan coordinated actions. I fear I have created something that poses a threat not just to marine ecosystems, but to human safety. The boat must be properly decontaminated before it can be sold, but my illness prevents me from completing the necessary procedures. But Dr. Hawthorne died before he could decontaminate the Windward Dream, and the boat was sold through his estate with no mention of her dangerous cargo. For years, the organisms remained dormant, waiting for the right conditions to resume their growth and reproduction. Sterling's extensive preparations and their long ocean passages had provided those conditions, awakening creatures that had learned to view humans not as symbiotic partners, but as threats to be eliminated. The broader implications of the Windward Dream disaster continue to concern maritime safety experts. If one boat could harbor such organisms unknowingly for years, how many others might be carrying similar threats? The investigation identified dozens of vessels that had been owned by marine researchers, and most of those boats remain in service with owners who have no knowledge of their potentially dangerous histories. Sterling never sailed again, The trauma of losing his crew and watching his dream boat consumed by its own internal ecosystem left him unable to trust any vessel completely. But he has become an advocate for new inspection protocols that focus on the hidden spaces within boat structures, the sealed areas that most surveyors assume are permanently inaccessible and therefore safe to ignore. His message to fellow sailors is urgent and specific. The space between your keel and your hull, the voids in sandwich core construction, the sealed areas behind interior panels, these are the places where real danger might be hiding. Previous owners may have introduced organisms or materials that could pose long-term threats to both your boat's structural integrity and your personal safety. The inspection protocols that Sterling helped develop are now available to marine surveyors, but they're not yet mandatory. Most boat buyers still rely on traditional surveys that examine obvious systems while ignoring the hidden spaces where the real threats might lurk. It's a gap in our safety culture that continues to put sailors at risk. The one place on a sailboat that most surveyors never check isn't just a potential source of structural problems. It's a potential ecosystem that could be harboring intelligence we're not prepared to confront. The Windward Dream's final voyage proved that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one you've been carrying with you all along, waiting patiently for the right moment to reveal its true nature and intentions. Modern boat construction is beginning to incorporate lessons learned from the Windward Dream disaster. New keel designs include inspection ports and drainage systems that prevent the accumulation of organic matter. Builders are required to document any modifications to standard construction, creating paper trails that future owners can follow. But thousands of older boats remain in service with the same vulnerabilities that proved fatal to Sterling's crew. The next time you step aboard a sailboat, remember Sterling's story. Listen carefully to the sounds your boat makes when she's quiet. Notice any unusual odors, especially organic ones that seem to come from inaccessible areas. Pay attention to any signs of unexplained corrosion or deterioration, particularly around keel attachment points and other sealed structural areas. Your boat's history matters more than most people realize. Who owned it before you? What did they use it for? Are there modifications or installations that aren't documented in the normal places? The answers to these questions could mean the difference between a successful voyage and a disaster that investigators will struggle to explain. The ocean has always been full of mysteries, but the Windward Dream taught us that some mysteries are traveling with us, hidden in the spaces we never think to check, learning about us while we sleep peacefully above, never suspecting that we're sharing our boat with intelligence that may not have our best interests at heart. Sterling's promise to himself was to reclaim his relationship with the ocean after years of viewing it as a battlefield. Instead, he discovered that the battlefield had been beneath his feet all along.